So we have someone who graciously offered to step in and do a community moment on rather short notice, and that's Marie Angell. So let's give her a warm welcome and thank her for doing that.
What you have to do in order to study the origins of Halloween and the surrounding festivities with that, we have to climb into the Wayback Machine. And we go back and we go back to the Middle Ages, and we keep going back because it turns out that celebrating festivals of the dead and fall turning into winter go back more than 2,000 years, but we can trace it to the ancient Celts in Ireland, UK, and even into northern France. And as with so many things, we find that we have to point a finger at how the Celts were robbed. Now, I'd like to point the finger at Lou, who I guess stepped out, because, so many things we want to blame on Lou, but in this case, he's exonerated because, as is usual, it was actually the Catholic Church who stole Halloween from the Celts. But the Celts had an ancient tradition of thinking that as the days grew longer and the time of winter and death and despair and deprivation came, that there was a little day, which they said at what we now consider October 31st, November 1st, as the day that the boundary between the living and the dead was fluid, and that the dead could come and walk the earth. But they would do mischief. And in order to protect themselves from the mischief, they would light large bonfires. And it was also thought that these bonfires would help the priests predict the future, which was very important to them because this was a time of uncertainty. And so they had the warmth of the fires, and they began to then think how they could protect themselves from the dead. So they started to want to appease the dead by leaving offerings of food and wine along the roads and outside their houses, and to keep the dead from coming inside, where they would want to, I guess, presumably, take up residence again. They didn't want that. So they also began to use hard vegetables like turnips and potatoes and beets to make lanterns out of it. And they would line the roads with these lanterns as well to sort of guide the dead away from the villages. And then they would extinguish the bonfires except for little embers from the bonfires, and they would start their new fires for the winter from that. And so that was their celebration. So this was a very big deal. This was the last big celebration before winter set in. So unfortunately, as things happen, about 40 AD, the Roman Empire came in, and they had their own dead celebrations and one thing and another, but the Romans were not they were pretty lax about, let's just merge everything, and so they didn't enforce certain rules. So these sort of celebrations that the Romans had began to merge, and with the Celts celebration of what is spelled Samhain, but is pronounced Samhain, probably. Let's hope. They're not here to correct me, so it's
Let's hope.
But one of the things that they brought, that the Romans contributed to the Halloween festivities, was they merged their celebration of the goddess Pomona, who was the goddess of fruits and vegetables. And they began, one of the things that the Romans did was use apples in their celebrations. And so the remaining Celts began to use apples. Everybody brought apples in. That was probably the origin of apple bobbing, which has kind of fallen out of favor in recent years, though I don't know why you don't want to stick your head in a tub which 20 other people are trying to bite apples in. You'd think that'd be number one on your list of festivities instead of wearing shirts like this. But anyway. But as always, it's all fun and games until the Pope shows up. So about 1000 AD, the Catholic Church said, there's too much of this, ghost worship, dead worship. We want more, look at us, what we're doing. So So they decided that they would continue their philosophy of you can't beat them, join them. And they co-opted these Celtic and Roman festivals that had sort of merged, and they decided that they would take over November 2nd as All Souls Day, and that would be a day to honor the dead. And they thought, well, that'll get rid of these Samhain sort of celebrations. So but they wanted a whole new thing. So they decided that they would have bonfires and parades, and they would dress up in costumes as saints and angels and devils. It'd be completely different. Every time with the parades, the poor citizens, because the poor citizens are always looking for an angle for something anyway, because they were destitute. So they started begging and asking for food during the parades, and they were given pastries that were called cell cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead. And this was called Going to Solon. That's one of my favorite too. I don't know why, because it kind of sounds like it's a blues band or a doo-wop group or something. But anyway, so eventually that sort of turned into where children started to just go house to house and ask for food, and they were given food and money and ale, because good old days. Yeah, who's going to turn that down? Well, it's a food group. So, but that still didn't kind of. There was too much melding of still those pagan holidays, and so they decided that they would sort of meld in with the Old Souls Day. They would have the day before, which was November 1st, be All Saints Day. And they would celebrate then the saints and the martyrs and the souls, and it all would be, then they would have control of this. Then the church would have control. So, of course, as is the way, people said, okay, we'll go to church on November 1st, and if we have to on November 2nd, but on the night before, we're going to have a party. And so over time, that day before became known as All Hallows Eve, which became Halloween, which I think is something that we're kind of familiar with. That's where we sort of pick up the thread of the story in America. But it took a while for that idea to cross the pond, because for some reason the Puritans were not so keen on celebrating Catholic traditions, being hardcore Protestants who were escaping all of that, plus not big party fans anyway. But the southern colonies were not so strict, as we know, because Southerners know how to have a good time. So they decided that they would have more public events. They kind of picked up that idea of having the public events and parades and things that they call play parties to celebrate the harvest. And they didn't so much dress up necessarily right away, but they did tell stories of their dead relatives and tell fortunes like the ancient Celts did, and they would dance and sing. And teenagers, especially boys, would carry on with mischief making a little bit, So it was all just good fun. But those were autumn festivals, they were called, and not so much a real what we would think of as Halloween celebration. They didn't really call it that. That was still all going on across the pond. So, but in the about 1840s, the Irish potato famine came along. And we had a huge immigration of Irish and Scottish come in. And they really liked their Halloween because those were their ancestors, and they kept that tradition going. So they brought what we think of as Halloween things with them. They dressed in costumes. They went started kind of going house to house. The young men would pull pranks like moving wagons from one place to another, or minor mischief like that, taking all the hay bales out and moving them around, which newspapers at the time called, good fun and not much trouble, but seemed like a lot of trouble. I would be really mad if my wagon was relocated and my hay was all gone. But they were more tolerant in those days. But anyway, this started to, as with so many things, it's all fun and then it keeps ramping up. So
and then the Pope shows up.
the Pope shows up. Well, the Pope in the form of city councils and things, because it's America, church and state, all of that. And so they began to want to say, well, let's get away from this Halloween stuff. Let's kind of go back to the autumn festivals. Let's go back to that and kind of have town-wide parties and be with adults and children and more about the treats and less about the trick part and get away from the ghosts and the pranks and the witchcraft, which kind of sounds like what's happening today, just as an aside. So I guess I have to stop sneering whenever I see that there's an autumn festival at some school and not Halloween, because that's just the old tradition. But so they wanted to make it more secular and kind of get away from those kind of Catholic overtones and pagan overtones. So, but as it is, people like people. It always comes back. People like a party. So in the 20s and 30s, the towns were still holding these, and in fact, there were several towns that had what they called Halloween Mardi Gras, which I thought sounded really cool. We should bring that back. But because of vandalism, it was still kind of a problem, and there was sort of an uneasy peace with this idea. But by the 50s, so things sort of coalesced into what we now think of as Halloween traditions. So they're really not that old, because I'm from the 50s, so it's not that long ago. And in fact, you can credit or blame the baby boomers, choose your poison, for making Halloween the way it is now, because it was in fact the baby boom and the subsequent move out to suburbs and concentrations of huge numbers of children that made the idea of having more school-based and home-based festivities and neighborhood activities more feasible, because people didn't want to come out and have town celebrations and drag their kids along and spoil the fun on that. So it became more about kids. And commercial businesses, of course, seized that as an opportunity to exploit it, as we do today. And now it became a huge commercial industry, which involves candy and pumpkins. So I wanted to talk about candy and pumpkins a little bit specifically, because that, to me, is Halloween, candy, pumpkins. Candy, there's 1/4 of the candy in America is sold in relation to Halloween. So it's like $2 billion, so it's a lot of money. And but it wasn't always this way. Candy really didn't come into the picture until the 20s and 30s in America. And even then, they were still, for a long time, they were still giving out salt cakes and one thing or another over and across the pond. And then fruit and, little homemade things. But in the 30s and 40s, you'd still get coins and nuts and fruit and even toys when you went for Halloween. And sometimes some candy, maybe it was homemade. Occasionally, it might be store-bought. But that, those were kind of hard times, so you didn't necessarily get that. The big holidays for candy makers were Christmas and Easter. And I did not know this. Washington's birthday was a close third. Whatever happened to those Washington's birthday celebrations? The big treats were marzipan cherries and cocoa-dusted logs. That's what happened to Washington State. But in any case, in the 50s, as you recall, the baby boomers, the burbs and all of that, well, you started to say it was cheaper and easier to give out wrapped candies that you bought at the store, and the candy makers were all in for that, and they began to do special packaging like this. Rest in peace. Very alive.
Very alive.
A moment of silence for me. And they exploited that, of course, and it became this huge spiral of more candy by candy makers, more trick-or-treaters, and it built up into this big industry. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that the candy makers were just sitting around from 1900, because that was actually around the early 1900s was when the huge candy makers that we know today, Hershey's, Mars, the other Mars, and that's a story in itself, because there was a Mr. Mars. He had worked for Hershey. He had an idea for some candies, and he started making them, and he used Hershey chocolate. He had a son who came into the business, another Mars. Mars Jr. got mad. They had a big falling out. He had ideas for candies. He went to England and started making Kit Kats. And so you have all of these things that are still around today, Hershey bars and Three Musketeers and Snickers and Milky Way bars. All came from that early 1900s when there was just a big candy rush, when you think that, as it were, you would think that that would have been the start of Halloween, really, as a candy holiday. But no, because what they put their heads together, and in 1916 they decided that they wanted to have a fall-oriented candy situation. And so they probably hired experts who came up with the idea of Candy Day. But that didn't take off the way they wanted. Anyway, so candy is a big thing, but we trace even by American standards, those are ancient roots, 1900s for our early 1900s for our candy. But pumpkins of course go way back to the Celts, the pagans probably before that. Not the idea of a pumpkin itself, because they didn't have pumpkins. Pumpkins are native to North America, which I did not know. But anyway, fun fact. But they were making lanterns, and they had started at some point between the pagans and modern times. They had started to put faces, ghoulish faces, probably to scare away the ghosts and the dead souls. So they had put these gruesome faces on. And so when the Irish came and the Scots, they said, they brought this tradition with them, but they saw pumpkins and they said, hey, that's a lot easier than trying to make a gruesome face on a beet. So that idea of carving into a pumpkin really took off, and in fact, pumpkin farmers began to breed special pumpkins, and in the 60s, a man named Howden developed what we know of today as our regular carving pumpkins. They were probably used at the pumpkin carving party. A special pumpkin that has somewhat thinner skin and has a thick stem and is really good for making jack-o'-lanterns. Really good, but not so good for eating, interestingly enough. If you tried to, because I've tasted pumpkins that were carving and I thought, but okay, I didn't know any different. But actually, if you want good eats, you got to get a sugar pie or a kabocha or a carnival pumpkin, which good luck with that. But anyway, those are the good eating ones. Or buy in a can like I do, if I'm going to buy in a can. But then I got to thinking, okay, fine, so you've got all this this great surge of pumpkin use. In fact, one newspaper called it the first reference, in fact, to using pumpkins as lanterns for Halloween, reported that a great sacrifice of pumpkins had been made for Halloween, and we sacrificed a bunch of pumpkins yesterday, I think. But again. But the idea of what we think of as the jack-o'-lantern, which is not a term you hear as much anymore, but when I was a kid, people called them jack-o'-lanterns all the time. That triangular face and that toothy, weird, missing teeth grin. I didn't really know where that came from, but there's a story. Because I'm going to stereotype the Irish here, but they like a story. We all like a story. We all like a story, and there's a story, so I'll end with the story of Stingy Jack. He is why we have the jack-o'-lantern. Stingy Jack, as you might tell by the name, was not a nice guy. He wasn't just stingy. He was deceitful. He was derelict. He was a thief and a con man. And he had legendary exploits. And the exploits were so legendary that the devil in hell heard about him. And the devil said, I don't really care for the competition. And I'm going to check this guy out. So he goes up to Earth, and he knows where Jack lives, and he lays in the road and pretends to be dead until Stingy Jack comes along and sees, there's a dead body here. I'll see if he's got any valuables on him. He starts searching the devil, and the devil says, hey! And Stingy Jack is kind of taken aback. Okay, it's the devil. Uh-oh, he's going to want my soul. And sure enough, the devil, says, you got nothing to lose. Why don't you sell me your soul? And Jack is a quick thinker. And he says, well, all right, I'll do it. I'll sell you my soul, but first I'm going to be in hell. It's parched. It's hot as hell there. And I'm sure those were exact words. And he said, can you buy me some drinks before I go? Let's go to the pub and have a few. And the devil said, oh, okay, all right. He liked to beer as well as the next guy. So he goes with Jack to the pub, and they just drain the whole place dry. And at the end of the night, the barkeep says, pay up. And Jack says, I don't have any money. So the devil says, all right, but the only way the devil can pay is if he turns himself into a coin. So the devil turns himself into a coin, and Jack takes it and he puts it in his pocket with a crucifix. So now the devil's trapped. He can't get out. There's a crucifix. And Jack is ignoring the fact that the bartender is really making angry faces at him. But he decides he's going to bargain with the devil now. And he's like, yeah, I'll let you out if you promise to never take my soul into hell. And the devil's like, I'm stuck here. The guy has outwitted me. Okay, fine. He agrees. I'll never take you into hell. Jack says, good deal. So then the story doesn't ever mention whether they paid the bar tab. But anyway, Jack goes about his business, but he's an alcoholic con man, and he dies pretty quickly after that. So but he's like, I'm not going to go to hell. So he saunters up to the pearly gates, and he says, here I am. And St. Peter looks him over, and he says, this guy, no, you're not coming in. No, sorry. Move along. So Jack is like, finally, I've been defeated. I have been defeated. I'm going to have to go, and I'm going to have to go to hell now. So he goes up to the gates of hell and says, you got me. And the devil says, oh, no. We made a deal. I'm a man of my word, so to speak. Not going to let you in. Too bad. And Jack's like, oh. And the devil says, I guess you're just doomed to wander the earth forever now. And Jack says, fine. But it's dark out there. Can you give me, some light or something? And so the devil gives him an ember from the fires of hell. And Jack, who happens to have a turnip in his pocket, because he likes to snack on turnips, carves out the turnip real quick and puts the ember in the turnip. And that became the first jack-o'-lantern.